News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. One military officer said today the waging of war is flat out simple. The restoration of peace is a challenge. In the war, a Saudi Arabian official said today he thinks the Iraqis suffered 85 to 100,000 casualties. For the generals, it is now a time to police the battlefield and await a formal ceasefire. For the politicians, it is time to think of rebuilding the region. For the men and women who fought the war, it is time for another countdown. We begin tonight with ABC's Bob Zelnick on who will be coming home first and when.
Pentagon plans call for the U.S. to begin withdrawing forces within the next 2 weeks, but sources here warn that withdrawal will be a lengthy process.
It was a Herculean logistic task to get them there, and thank God, because our casualties were so light, it's going to be just about as Herculean to get them back.
According to Pentagon plans, among the first Army units to be called home in coming weeks will be from the Rapid Deployment Force ordered to the Gulf last August. These include the 82nd Airborne from Fort Bragg, the 101st Airborne from Fort Campbell, and the 24th Mechanized Infantry from Fort Stewart.
Right now, this country has no strategic reserve ground force in the country. So from a strategic national standpoint, it's important to get those units home first.
Military sources say that 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades and other elements from the 1st Marine Division, which also arrived in the country last summer, will also be among the first to leave. Air Force officials privately expect fighter aircraft and their crews to begin departing Saudi Arabia within the next week or two. But Pentagon sources expect at least 2 air wings plus a vast amount of pre-positioned weapons and equipment to remain in Saudi Arabia. Navy sources say that 2 carrier battle groups, the Saratoga and the Kennedy, will shortly be leaving the area to be replaced by the carriers Forrestal and Nimitz. A heavy naval presence using port facilities in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia will remain for years. It is not clear yet when the 75,000 reservists in the region will leave. Some will be needed to help Kuwait rebuild. These include specialists in mine clearing, as well as engineers, civil affairs officers, and morticians. And some of the reserve troops, who are specialists in transportation and logistics, will have to stay on duty for a while, loading the regular troops and equipment or carrying them home. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
The military briefer at the Pentagon, General Kelly, said today that as of now, in his view, the Iraqi army is a rabble. And now, with the war's sudden end, we're just beginning to get a real look at what it was like. ABC's Jim Wooten has been with the Army's 3rd Armored Division. They saw some of the heaviest fighting.
They rolled into Iraq on the first day of the war and spent the next 2 chasing an enemy on the run. They were looking for someone to fight. Yesterday morning, they found him. Some of the Republican Guard in Soviet-built tanks finally turned, having decided to defend their homeland. And the 3rd Armored's 3rd Brigade took them head-on.
You got the grid on that 9 T-72 suspected that we got from Lead? Roger, we do. Okay, we're still sneaking up to take a look at that, but I don't want to go past these bunkers till we shoot above.
They combined pinpoint artillery with laser-guided rockets from multiple launch systems, and on call an Air Force F-16, falling like a rock on its target. It dropped cluster bombs. 2,800 separate detonations. From then on, it was a rout. Most of the Iraqis fled. Many hundreds surrendered, eager to be captured, thanking the Americans for the food and water. Some who'd tried to run were decapitated by their officers, their bodies left in their trenches. Those few who decided to fight died, turned to ash in their vehicles. Oddly enough, on this modern armored battlefield, there were almost no craters, only direct hits. And the 3rd Armored raced on, headed east into Kuwait, destroying more than an entire division's worth of Iraqi armor. leaving behind only their tracks and the glow of dead tanks burning in the desert dusk. If there ever was any confusion about the essential objective of the Americans, at least, that's certainly been removed in the last couple of days. It wasn't terrain and it wasn't territory. It was the complete and utter destruction of an army already badly beaten. And even with the ceasefire in effect, that destruction continued. This abandoned Iraqi armored personnel carrier with ammunition supplied courtesy of Jordan was bypassed in yesterday's headlong assault. Today, along with dozens of others, it wasn't.
We're destroying a lot of the old equipment. Or not old equipment, well, they're old equipment, but we're making sure it's not going to be used again.
It could have been a lot tougher than this.
We thought it would be. We really did. We thought it would be a lot tougher.
How can you explain that it hasn't been?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm glad it's like this, but I have no idea why it is.
Only one of Colonel Goff's men was killed, only 2 were wounded, and not a single piece of equipment was lost to Iraqi fire. And after moving 150 miles through the Iraqi desert and 10 more into Kuwait, it was over and done. Jim Wooten, ABC News in northwest Kuwait.
The military says there were no further American casualties overnight. The total remains 79 dead and 45 missing. This represents 1/3 to 1/6 of the Pentagon's lowest estimates before the war began. ABC's Bill Redeker reports on the military picture overall in the Gulf today.
The 100-hour ground war left behind a battlefield littered with destroyed Iraqi tanks. A cemetery of twisted armor that revealed the destructive power of Allied tanks, artillery, and aircraft. U.S. commanders said of the 42 Iraqi divisions committed to the battle and their 4,200 tanks, less than 1 division remained intact, and only about 300 tanks survived, most of them having fled back to Iraq. American forces have not withdrawn. Instead, they have taken up defensive positions around Kuwait and southern Iraq in case the ceasefire is broken.
There's a sense of exhilaration and at the same time let down at the end of this thing. Be careful. This is probably the most dangerous part of this operation.
There were 2 violations today. American generals said they believe some Iraqi units didn't get the word.
For instance, at 12:30 this afternoon, Iraqi T-55 tanks and multiple rocket launchers fired on elements of the 18th Airborne Corps as they were trying to remove the remains of U.S. pilots that were killed in a UH-60 helicopter crash. We responded and destroyed 2 T-55 tanks and 2 multiple rocket launchers. That's the way it's going to work.
Cleaning up the battlefield meant blowing up disabled Iraqi tanks and artillery.
We're destroying a lot of the old equipment. Or not old equipment, well, they're old equipment, but we're making sure it's not going to be used again.
Other Iraqi armor was abandoned by soldiers who had surrendered. Some of the tanks will be shipped back to the United States for inspection and will be used in training.
This is the mortar right here.
Watch, they got a lot of loose grenades laying around inside, too.
The Iraqi torching of Kuwaiti oil wells and destruction of storage tanks has left a mess in the desert. There is so much oil flowing out of broken pipelines and wellheads that black crude is collecting in giant lakes. Some of those responsible for this are now in prisoner of war camps. Late today, the British Ministry of Defense said there could be as many as 175,000 Iraqi POWs. Sorting out those who may be prosecuted for war crimes will be one of the military's most difficult tasks in the coming weeks. In the coming weeks, the most difficult task for 500,000 American troops here will be dealing with the anticipation of going home. These soldiers got the message on the battlefield this morning a few hours before the ceasefire took effect.
In 2 hours, it's over. Who said that?
President Bush.
It's on the radio? No, man, in 2 hours, it's over. In 2 hours, it's over. Yeah! Isn't peace wonderful?
It's great.
Too bad it couldn't have come sooner.
Tonight, the ceasefire is holding. But as one general here said, the Iraqi army doesn't have much left to break it. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
From the Soviets today, realism and a touch of resentment. The Soviets sold Iraq much of its military hardware. Today, the Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov says the failure of Iraqi's air defenses has led the Soviets to review their own air defense system, which he says has weak spots. Another senior Soviet military official says that many of the Soviet weapons used by Iraq were old, and the Iraqi army, in his words, left much to be desired. In a moment, working out the ceasefire and afterwards, joy and outrage in Kuwait City, and chasing away the demons of Vietnam.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
And how to implement a full ceasefire satisfaction that Iraq had agreed to another of the conditions laid down by the Allies. Here's ABC's Britt Hume.
During an Oval Office meeting with Kuwaiti Ambassador Saud al-Sabah, the president said Iraq had formally agreed to Mr. Bush's demand for a meeting of military commanders in the war zone. Exact time and place to be determined to address the coalition's requirements for a formal ceasefire.
They have met this one condition, which is very good, and they've met it promptly, and that is that we're going to get together and send high-level military representatives, and we are going to get back our POWs, and we're going to do it fast.
Showing a very different kind of emotion, the president introduced his guest.
And the second subject, but the one that brings the ambassador here, is the chance to tell him how pleased we Americans are that his country is free, and we're very pleased to have had a major role in it.
The ambassador expressed the thanks of his nation to this one and to its president.
There isn't, I believe, a more precious gift that could be given to people than their freedom and their liberty and their homeland. And Mr. President, you have done this. And you will go down in history as the great liberator of my country. And our hearts go also to the families of the victims that have lost their lives bravely in Operation Desert Storm. Our condolences to them. They have not died in vain. And Mr. President, I hope sooner rather than later we would welcome you and welcome all our friends in liberated Kuwait.
It is a special day, and Ambassador, I just can't tell you what's in my heart, but I am very pleased, very proud that your country's free.
Outside afterward, the emotion of that meeting gave way to talk of grim business still ahead. Al-Sabah told reporters about 2,000 Kuwaitis were killed during the Iraqi occupation, and that between 4,000 and 5,000 Kuwaitis and others were taken hostage before the ground war started, when even more were seized. Officials here say that until Allied commanders can get information from their Iraqi counterparts about the whereabouts of those people, there will be no full ceasefire, no end to the occupation, and above all, no end to economic sanctions. Britt Hume, ABC News, the White House.
Well, the immediate focus of this diplomacy continues to be the United Nations Security Council, which must agree to the terms of any ceasefire. ABC's David Enzo reports that negotiations between the U.S. and Iraq now center on their UN ambassadors.
The two men have met twice since President Bush's speech, today at the United Nations and last night when U.S. Ambassador Pickering delivered a copy of the demands Mr. Bush made to the home of Iraq's al-Anbari. Iraqi diplomats say by this morning al-Anbari had word from Baghdad. Everything the White House wants, Iraq is ready to give, including early release of Allied prisoners of war and Kuwaiti hostages.
We would like to expedite, actually, the repatriation of all prisoners of war as well as other third countries' nationals.
But the U.S. wants the Security Council to issue another list of demands that Iraq must meet, or the Allies will reserve the right to resume offensive military operations. The demands include everything from having the Iraqi parliament rescind its annexation of Kuwait to the return of Kuwaiti assets like airplanes and automobiles. The Security Council is expected to vote tomorrow on the new list. Despite the demands, Iraqi diplomats, who until 2 days ago were still blasting the U.S., today called the meeting between their ambassador and the American sympathetic. The U.S. version, no comment. David Ensor, ABC News at the United Nations.
With fighting over, help is finally on the way to Baghdad. The European community has announced an emergency donation of $700,000 to buy water purification equipment. Allied bombing destroyed the city's water and electrical power facilities, and a mobile water treatment plant will arrive on Saturday. We'll have more news in a moment. Begins the really serious effort to document all the charges that Kuwaiti citizens were mistreated, tortured, even murdered during the 7 months of occupation. The British say they are questioning at least 5,000 Iraqi troops they have as prisoners. It will take time to sort out the facts. ABC's Jim Hickey reports that in Kuwait City today there is anger as well as joy.
Kuwaiti resistance fighters moved in on a library today to flush out Iraqi soldiers hiding there. The Kuwaitis had help from U.S. troops.
Want to put fire on that building with the 40 millimeter?
Not yet. Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Let's get the civilians out.
The Americans waited a few minutes before opening fire on the library. Kuwaitis stormed the building and captured the squad of Iraqi soldiers. The resistance says it has caught 120 Iraqis since yesterday. The prisoners in this Kuwait City jail admit they tortured civilians. That's right, said this man. We did it. We are soldiers. What are we supposed to do? We do what we are ordered. Stories of alleged mistreatment and murder come from almost every Kuwaiti here. This resistance fighter says the Iraqis held him 2 months. He said he was forced to sit here and was tortured with fire.
Under the chair there's a fire. And they told us to sit in it without clothes.
This man, suspected by Iraqis of being a member of the Kuwaiti resistance, says he was hung upside down and burned with electric shocks.
I sat in one room. They beat me. Before they asked, they beat me.
This woman says the Iraqis took over her house and shot a member of her family.
One of my cousins was killed. They shot 14 shots in his head.
14 shots?
14, yeah. And he thrown him just like this, in the street.
In the city morgue today, Kuwaitis searched for relatives who disappeared. Many of these victims also had been shot. American troops today stormed the U.S. Embassy. They surrounded the compound and rappelled from a helicopter, looking for more hidden Iraqi soldiers, or for bombs and booby traps the Iraqis may have set. The troops apparently found some and blew them up. All over Kuwait City are the remnants of war left behind by the Iraqis, their weapons of destruction and the destruction they caused. 60-ton Iraqi tanks straddled highway dividers, evidence they were driven out of control as Iraqi soldiers fled the city. Kuwaitis danced on some of those weapons today. They danced in the streets as well. The freedom celebration continued full steam. Jim Hickey, ABC News, Kuwait City.
Kuwait's government in exile, which is still in Saudi Arabia, is telling Kuwaitis not to return home right away. They say Kuwait is still a dangerous place, that exile should wait until mines and unexploded bombs are removed and power, water, and medical care restored. We'll have more news in a moment. We have heard repeatedly from the President and the military commanders that the Gulf War would not be another Vietnam. The question is, how far will the war in the Gulf go towards making Vietnam less of a national millstone? ABC's Jeff Greenfield thinks it will make a big difference.
USA! USA! You are looking at an exorcism. An America ridding itself of a ghost that has haunted it for a quarter of a century. This is where it began, in a war whose victory never came, whose purpose was never defined, whose morality was never clear. Vietnam ended as no war had ever ended for America, in defeat. The sense of national impotence this caused deepened in 1980, when we could not even rescue our hostages in Iran because the helicopters broke down in the desert. It deepened again in 1983 when 240 Marines were killed in their barracks in Lebanon. In the Gulf, everything seemed to work. The weapons did what they were supposed to do, and instead of the tactical skill of the Viet Cong, there was an enemy utterly routed. The men who symbolized the military were different this time as well. In Vietnam, there were promises that were never kept, and a widening gap between what was said and what happened. This time, there was no credibility gap. The American public believed what the generals said. The language was not the doublespeak of Vietnam, but clear and blunt.
First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
And there was nothing like the confusion that surrounded Vietnam. The president's commitment of troops was massive from the start. Support from the world community was consistent. And unlike Vietnam, where the war escalated almost without public debate, the Congress this time debated and ultimately approved the use of force. In Vietnam, it seemed to some as if we were fighting the very people we had gone there to defend. How, critics asked, could it be a moral war if we were destroying what we claimed to be saving? It's far too early, of course, to know what the future will bring, whether other conflicts will be seen as clearly and as clearly justified as this one. But we can be sure that the images of Vietnam that filled our popular culture, with good and evil hopelessly entangled, will not be seen this time. That what most Americans will take from this war is the sense that its rightness was as clear as its outcome. Jeff Greenfield, ABC News, New York.
We'll be back in just a moment. From General Schwarzkopf yesterday, you may remember that he said the Allies deceived the Iraqis into thinking an invasion would come from the sea. Well, there was some further evidence today that it worked. Allied troops entering Kuwait City have found a school building that the Iraqis used as a headquarters. And inside was a room-sized model of the entire city laid out on the floor with all the guns pointing towards the sea for the amphibious landing that never was. The elaborate model had been created from sand and marked out with wooden strips to denote highways, tanks, and artillery pieces. There were coils of wire strung around the seashore whose beaches are still sown with mines. There were even symbols indicating that some Iraqi troops were equipped with chemical weapons. In a moment, when our special edition of World News Tonight continues, the Royal Artillery takes on the Republican Guard, and on the home front, waiting for the men and the women to come back.
This special edition of World News Tonight with Peter Jennings continues.
President Bush said today that Iraq has accepted another of the Allied coalition's demands. Iraq has ordered its military commanders to meet with Allied generals to talk about ceasefire terms. That would include an exchange of POWs. The French Foreign Minister, Roland Dumas, met with Mr. Bush today at the White House, the two men congratulating each other on the outcome of the war, and the British were also expressing pride in their achievement. British soldiers made up the second largest fighting force, 45,000 troops, and the 1st Armored Division and the Royal Artillery played a significant role in the victory over the Republican Guard. This is how the British television pool reporter Martin Bell covered some of their exploits.
It was late afternoon, overcast, just inside Iraq. The British were preparing to go to war in full armored formation for the first time in 46 years. The tanks are out in front and either side of us. For 15 miles, no sign of the Iraqis. And then?
We think we may have a thermal contact vehicle dug in at about 4,000 in front of us.
It's the first outpost of a large entrenched Iraqi position. The battle group pauses and at 1 in the morning delivers its response. A bombardment by multi-launch rocket systems and 2 full regiments of 155mm howitzers firing for 23 minutes. The purpose is to make the Iraqis inclined to surrender rather than fight. Purpose achieved. They hadn't been fed for 4 days, hadn't been paid since November. Many of their officers had fled to Basra the night before, leaving the men to fend for themselves. And these are the lucky ones. They march from the battlefield as the British prepare another phase of the assault. The target here is a T-55 tank and small arms fire is returned. But not for long, as the battle group scorches everything in its path. In the inside of the day, the British have overrun the position, taken about 1,000 prisoners. And so to today, and minutes before the ceasefire, the flags were being flown as a precaution against so-called friendly fire. The British had taken more casualties from the Americans fighting alongside them than from the Iraqis they were fighting against. It was a reminder to the Americans to take care. We are here across the main road between Kuwait and Basra. Our mission is to intercept any enemy convoys, but it's already like a battlefield here, and nothing's getting through. For the 7th Armoured Brigade, rolling through the gates of a former Iraqi position, this is the end of a short but intensive war. And if this is what the Iraqis call victory, one can only wonder what defeat must look like.
We've achieved the aim, and we've kicked the Iraqis out of Kuwait, with very few casualties to ourselves. So I think, you know, it's tremendous relief.
Even the ceasefire wasn't quite the end of it. 2 hours afterwards, gunners acting as infantry suspected that Iraqis were still in what had been a headquarters bunker. A grenade assured them that all was clear, and they continued with a cautious inspection of what had probably been a divisional base and was certainly a missile site. The launching ramp was there, facing southward, and one of the missiles themselves hidden in the plantation here, a medium-range frog of the kind that had been directed against American forces in Saudi Arabia.
There's clearly evidence in the bunkers of guys just having Baghdad. I mean, there's teapots on, hot tea.
They searched the place from end to end this morning, finding it empty of soldiers, but not deserted.
We've not got any bread or biscuits or something in the warrior?
Brown, biscuits, brown.
The Iraqis left 3 horses behind, so starved they had been gnawing the bark of a tree. The horses' war is over, and so, we hope, is the Army's. This is Martin Bell with 7th Armoured Brigade for the British Television News Pool.
And so British forces, like Americans, will soon begin to come home. The White House today echoed the sentiments we've already heard from the Pentagon. It will take time. The White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwater said it took 7 months to get in, and it's going to take a lot of months to get out. Some units could be coming home in a few weeks. The Pentagon says as much as possible it will be first in, first out, with units ordered to the Gulf last August, among the first to be called home. That makes the 24th Mechanized Division from Fort Stewart, Georgia, eligible to be near the top of the list. Here's ABC's Al Dale.
Anxious wives of combat soldiers listened closely to President Bush's declaration last night and wept with joy at what they heard.
For the first time in all these months, I feel hope.
It's up to Iraq whether ceasefire holds up.
This morning, military families eagerly sought information about the end of the war. At a briefing for family members at Fort Stewart, there was good news for those worried about loved ones involved in the fierce tank battle with Iraq's Republican Guard.
During that tank battle, which is now going down in history, the 24th Infantry Division had no soldiers killed during that day-long battle.
There's a lot of optimism here that it's all over but the homecoming. People are even talking about the day they can take down all the yellow ribbons. But most are guarding against getting their hopes up too high.
Yeah, I'm excited that the fighting has stopped, but like before the war there was casualties, so after the war there could be casualties, so I'm not going to be happy that my husband is in my arms.
At a popular department store in Hinesville, Army wives lined up to have baby pictures made. Photos they were going to send to their husbands in the Gulf, but now they say they'll just hold on to them until they come home. At Trudy's Hairstyles, where several Army wives work, relief that the worst may be behind them.
You feel like your life's not on hold anymore. You can finally have something to look forward to.
Families here say it's only fitting that since the 24th Infantry Division was among the first units sent over last summer, it is scheduled to be among the first to return. Al Dale, ABC News, Hinesville, Georgia.
In a moment, how the peace came to Baghdad. On the American agenda tonight, how one rural county copes with the absences of war, and the political scramble for victory on Capitol Hill. The radio said today that Iraq had punched a hole in the myth of American superiority and rubbed America's nose in the dust. On the streets of Baghdad, the reaction was primarily relief. ABC's Bill Blakemore is there.
In the same hour this morning in which the American ceasefire went into effect, the markets of Baghdad suddenly swelled to overflowing for the first time in a month and a half, with people eager to enjoy shopping again. People let their memories of last night's fierce bombing raid on Baghdad be pushed aside by the sounds of business, the sight of goods, and the smells of spices and herbs. They had learned of the ceasefire not from Baghdad radio, which announced nothing until mid-morning, but from Voice of America and British broadcasts. Yet the spirit of these Iraqi crowds was not one of defeat.
We are not defeated. That doesn't mean defeated.
Everyone we talked to in the markets told us that Iraq had been victorious every day that it held out in battle. One country against 28, led by the mightiest superpower. When Baghdad radio did make an announcement, it said Iraqi forces had inflicted heavy casualties on coalition troops yesterday, and that had convinced the Americans to stop fighting. The first day following the good news of ceasefire has been one of enormous relief and happiness for the people of Baghdad. But they have not yet heard any clear descriptions of the fate of Iraqi soldiers in Kuwait. They have not heard what the number of Iraqi casualties might be. That information is bound to become clear in coming days as Iraqis listen to the radio broadcasts of various countries. But as the sun set tonight on Baghdad, many people, for the first time in a month and a half, did not go inside or to shelters, but stayed outside and enjoyed the evening and the clear skies. Bill Blakemore, ABC News in Baghdad.
For the Arabs in the rest of the region, the reaction today depends a lot on which side they were on. The notion of Arab unity did get some lip service. Here's ABC's Jerry King.
The banner headlines were written in red, but Egyptians reacted with quiet satisfaction to Iraq's defeat.
Relieved. I feel relieved now.
Well, it's better like this, and he deserved it, Saddam Hussein.
This housewife called it a joy that cannot be described. Of Saddam Hussein, she said he must commit suicide. That was not the view in Jordan, which was and still is staunchly pro-Saddam. In something of a state of collective shock, up to 2,000 Jordanians staged an anti-American, pro-Palestinian march, refusing to believe their man had been beaten.
The ultimate goal of the United States is to make us feel that we are defeated as Arabs, as Muslims, but we are not.
In Syria, a longtime bitter foe of Iraq, government newspapers said all Saddam had achieved was devastation, destruction, and bloodshed. Syria's president, Hafez al-Assad, said Arabs need to learn to cooperate, not to make such mistakes. That sentiment is being echoed across the Arab world.
The main concern at this juncture is to be sure that this situation in the Arab world not to stand in the way of overcoming the elements of frustration and instability throughout the region.
Throughout the region, that means resolving the fate of the Palestinians. With the war over, the #1 hope here is that the United States and all the Arabs will make a serious effort to settle that question. Jerry King, ABC News, Cairo.
Despite the end of the fighting, the Palestinians under Israeli occupation continue to spend most of their time under curfew. In Israel itself, the Scud alert was lifted today, and the streets of Tel Aviv were packed again. With the Iraqi military so effectively diminished, now there is concern about what the U.S. will try to do next. In the political arena, that is. ABC's Dean Reynolds is in Tel Aviv.
You could almost hear the country sigh with relief.
The state of emergency in Israel is over. Israeli residents should pack their gas masks back into their original cases and store them at home. The residents are also requested to remove the seals at home or at work.
This was Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv 6 weeks ago, deserted and waiting for scuds. And this is Dizengoff now. Same street, one war later.
God bless America.
They played it all day on the radio here, a refrain of gratitude to the USA for ending a nightmare.
Very good. You can see the faces of the people. It's nice now.
But Israelis are still digging out from this war, and they are still angry about Saddam Hussein.
I'm not happy that he is still alive, this criminal.
The Israeli military would have liked Saddam Hussein to disappear, but he is still in power, with at least some of his Scud missiles. And the government here sees another threat in the post-war period. The concern is that Secretary of State Baker is coming here to propose Arab-Israeli negotiations that may involve conceding Israeli-occupied land for peace. Prime Minister Shamir is already working on what he calls sophisticated methods to withstand pressure for compromise. One method, convince the U.S. to put pressure elsewhere.
Turn to the Arab world and say, this must end. This unrelenting war of half a century that seeks to annihilate a sovereign state off the face of the earth. This has to end.
But for now, Israelis are just happy to scan the night sky and see nothing but the moon. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Tel Aviv.
We'll have more news in just a moment. Know they will be coming home. The government has put out a reminder that when they actually get back, they are all entitled to have their old jobs back, or at least comparable ones. The call-up has put a strain on hundreds of communities. Perhaps those of us in the big cities don't feel it as much, perhaps because we're not quite as connected to our neighbors. But in small places like Clay County, Alabama, it's a much different story. Tonight's agenda reporter is Rebecca Chase.
Just beyond the Talladega National Forest, where the piney woods turns into pastures, is Clay County, Alabama.
This is a rural community, but we're very close-knit. People care about each other.
Families mean a lot to people around here. Family and friends.
We've always been very patriotic, and this is just not a show of our men being gone. We're fighting for our country, and it's our duty, and we're going to see it through.
2 National Guard units from this county went to the Gulf. 250 people.
I don't think we've ever seen that many people at once leave our community like that.
Everywhere you go, there's someone missing, and there are a lot of empty chairs.
Empty chairs, missing people at the schools, the hospital, city hall, farms, small businesses.
It hasn't been easy or even possible to fill all the holes left behind, especially the emotional ones. But this is a place where families are strong, religion is deeply felt, and people have found they can count on each other.
While elementary school principal Bobby Vinson is in Saudi Arabia, the high school principal is doing double duty. The vacancy left by high school shop teacher Jerry Bennett is being filled by a local furniture maker. With 9 members of the rescue squad in the Gulf, the remaining volunteers are working harder. All over the county, families are filling in. Helen Norrid is a beautician, but since her husband was called up, she is also a farmer.
I had to learn to drive the tractor and do a lot of things I'd never done before, you know.
But you're doing it, right?
I'm doing it.
At the Midway Quick Stop, while owner Ronnie Robertson is away, his wife Jean runs the store.
Thank you. Have a good day. I think I've done a lot better than I thought. The day he left, I thought, you know, I'm never going to make it.
A steady stream of support keeps both Jean and Helen going.
There's probably 50, 60 people a day that want to know, have you heard from him today, or did he call last night? Or
the phone rings every night, all night long. People calling me and telling me that they'll help me, and it's been great.
I ain't gonna stay one no more. I ain't gonna stay one no more.
Faith has been an important source of strength for the people here. They sing for peace, still they speak of their guardsmen with pride.
He's over there not just for his family, he's over there for everybody's family.
Yet beneath the support and public displays of patriotism, there have been private doubts.
You do wonder if it's worth it, of course. But it's when it's your own husband, it's a little bit hard. You have to admit it. I mean, if you're honest, you have to admit that it is hard.
This is my baby, Irvin.
Nearly every week, those with relatives in the Gulf have gathered to share their news.
There's only been one time that Carl sounded down.
Even people who live on opposite sides of town have been brought together by the war.
You have 4 there now?
I got 4 boys over there.
It's just a togetherness. It's a feeling that we all share, and it's not a black war and it's not a white war. It's our war.
That's all right. You just saved 2 or 3 trips.
We've learned now to depend on each other.
We pray, dear Father, that you would bless those, dear Father, who are in foreign lands.
Touched by the war in indelible ways, people here have found strength in themselves and in their community.
Let every heart say amen.
Amen. Rebecca Chase, ABC News, Clay County, Alabama.
We'll be back over in the Gulf, and the attempt to capitalize on it has already begun. On Capitol Hill, that includes Republicans and Democrats doing a little early sniping at one another. Here's ABC's Cokie Roberts.
Republicans responded to the news of victory by declaring their own victory over the Democrats who voted against going to war.
We've got a lot of apologizing to do in this House. I beg you, Mr. Speaker, get some of your members to be real men and women and come to that lectern and say they were wrong about sanctions.
The president was right, the majority of Congress was right, and it's time for all members of this House to admit and congratulate the President of the United States as well as the troops.
And Democrats tried to claim some of the victory for themselves, or at least their constituents.
At least 5 southwestern Indiana firms are demonstrating exemplary leadership and compassion in making significant expenditures for pay and benefits to their employees engaged in Desert Storm.
I'm especially proud of North Carolina's role in this conflict.
Democrats look at President Bush's phenomenal approval ratings and figure their only hope politically is to change the subject.
We have several wars to fight here at home.
They want it both ways, to talk about failure at home and success abroad.
And hopeful that when the troops come home, that we in this country can unite with the same common mission to solve so many problems that we have remaining in this country.
Late today, the Senate commended the president's Persian Gulf success. With that bit of bipartisanship out of the way, it's back to politics as usual, with Republicans trying to reap whatever they can out of the war and Democrats trying to shift attention to problems here at home. Cokie Roberts, ABC News, Capitol Hill.
And there are problems. The Ford Motor Company announced plans today to cut $3 billion in costs this year, in part by laying off or giving early retirement to some of the company's white-collar workers. Top management will lose its merit pay increases and its bonuses. We'll have our final report in the country's mood. While the polls have always indicated a great deal of popular support for the war, they've also shown that many people feared the war would drag on and that American casualties would be high. And so the quick end to the fighting has come as an enormous relief. Here's ABC's Ken Kashiwahara.
I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight,
many Americans had not expected the war to end so soon, so many welcomed it with an explosion of emotion in sports arenas.
And you can see the reaction. What a moving moment.
On city streets. Nowhere was the anticipation greater, the expectations higher than among relatives of soldiers in the Persian Gulf as they listened to the president's announcement.
My husband's coming home. They're all coming home. I can quit telling my kids Daddy will be home soon. I can tell them Daddy's coming home now. That just means so much.
Today, they continued to celebrate in Aiken, Minnesota, by posing for a town photograph to mark the end of the war. In Atlanta, a radio station threw a victory party. But as they went to work this morning, some commuters began reflecting about the future, about what they said still has to be done.
I think Saddam Hussein still has to go out of power.
In churches across the country, Americans prayed and gave thanks.
We are grateful to Almighty God for the gift of a ceasefire.
I'm pleased and overjoyed that it all seems to be working out as well as it did, and with such a minimal loss of life.
Throughout the war, many school children had been upset by the hostilities. Today, they talked about their feelings now.
I think the war part is terrible, but now that it's over and our troops are going to come home, I think it's great.
USA! USA!
And for many Americans, there was a surge of patriotic pride at what their country had done, what their soldiers had achieved. Ken Kashiwahara, ABC News, Los Angeles.
That's our report on World News Tonight. We'll have the latest on the situation in Iraq and Kuwait every hour on the hour. Later on Prime Time and Nightline, Sam Donaldson and Ted Koppel, both live from the Gulf. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.